Welcome to today's webinar, Canada's Place in the Shifting Global Order. As many of you have participated in some of the webinars of late, we've been discussing the turmoil. We've tried to stay off the personality of Mr. Trump, but it's awfully hard to do as we look at U.S. posturing and the changes in U.S. policy that seem to be coming at us daily. We're all looking for some element of pause. We're looking for some element of comfort, but even more so, we're looking for some reason as to what is really going on and why. And I'm hoping in the interview that I'll be conducting with Randolph Mank, who is an ambassador in numerous ambassadorships for Canada in various places of the world, we'll get a sense of his perspective on what's taking place and why. So welcome, Randolph.
Thank
Before I
you.
get started, I'm going to ask you if you might give us a little bit of background of your career. It's most interesting how you got into diplomacy and what you've been doing since. So if you'll give us a brief introduction.
Sure, I got into diplomacy somewhat by accidents and happenstance while studying in London for my doctorate. And just happened to go to the exam center with a friend of mine who was very keen on it. I was all set to be a professor of political science, but accidentally passed the Foreign Service exam and then found myself in Athens being trained as a vice consul for about 5 months, and then posted to Stockholm, thinking that I was going to be a European expert, and then was assigned to the Central America desk back in Ottawa, where the trips to the region were all about civil war and guerrilla fighters, the Contras. I see some other gray-haired types here who'll remember all the Central American shenanigans. Salvador, the FMLN Civil War, and all of that. And then thinking that that was going to be more of my career, I was suddenly sent to Jakarta, which was the first of two. And the second assignment in Jakarta, luckily, I got to be an ambassador for the first time. In between that, though, I was put in charge of the policy division. I was the head of foreign policy at Global Affairs. It was Foreign Affairs and International Trade back then. That was the name of that. And they asked us to do a foreign policy update, which morphed into a review. This was during the Chrétien Paul Martin government,
Mhm.
early 2000s. In fact, it started in 99 and really got going in 2000. And I built up the division so we had the horsepower to do a foreign policy review. And we were saying this will be interesting to you folks because it gets us right into the topic here. We were saying during that foreign policy review that we really had to admit, finally in public, that the United States, Canada-US relations was really primordial. It was really at the heart of our foreign policy. And that's kind of an obvious thing to say, but the first thing you do when you're going to do a foreign policy review is you look at the one before. So there was this document that came out in 1995 called Canada in the World, and it mentioned the United States in the most perfunctory manner. It was like it was just, yeah, okay. And of course, when we came up with a series of ideas around this theme that we're going to put Canada-US relations at the center, you quickly look at practical things, and it was all about what we called back then drugs and thugs, controlling the movement of drugs and thugs across the border. So what do you do practically? You can't just be a professor of political science when you're the head of policy for the Foreign Affairs Department. What do you do practically? It was border modernization. It was strengthening of our border uh, customs clearance and really practical, granular things like that that I won't bore you with in detail. But I remember taking it up in the first draft in a deck form to our foreign minister, John Manley, at the time. And it was our first presentation to the new minister about what we proposed to do with our foreign policy. And as an official, you're always nervous with the minister. And we made the presentation, and the lights came back up, and he looked at his political assistant and he said, "Tony, can you make any sense out of this?" Well, I said, "Yeah, Canada, US, of course, everybody knows it's important, but that's not what we talk about. That's not what average Canadians want to know about peacekeeping and things like that. So you're going to have to go back to the drawing board, lads, and come up with some more Canadian ideas for our new foreign policy. That was in August. 1 month later, the Twin Towers came crashing down. And John Manley was very good at the microphone, talking about exactly the things that we'd been talking about. And we did an emergency budget back then of I think it was like 7.5, $7.7 billion of spending. We created the Public Safety Agency to mirror what the Americans were doing with Homeland Security. We were asked, those of us who'd been working on it, to come up with all those cockamamie ideas that we had for Canada US and roll them into this budget and then work with the finance department. I also happened to be heading part of the policy tasking was to head the G7. It was actually the G8 back then, the G8 with Russia included. We were asked to come up with, I was the head of the secretariat in support of the G8. And so we went down to New York City because the Americans happened to be handing the baton to Canada at that very moment, just after 9/11. So we were touring the building, the building site, and there was still smoke coming out of the Twin Towers a month later, where we were having our meetings with Colin Powell and all the rest about what the Americans expected Canada to do in our G8 year, which was the Kananaskis Summit. And so, it was all about counterterrorism. It was about getting nuclear warheads off of the rusting Soviet subs. The Russians were right in on it. They were the first to call Bush to offer support and anything that could be done. And I wrote a counterterrorism strategy in my basement when I had a moment, and it was all about anti-money laundering and also practical things about tracking terrorists and so on. So I'm getting carried away and into the weeds here, but I think that's a point of entry into the topics you folks want to discuss, and they are certainly very
So
topical.
that in
I
a way that brings us to today, the
Yeah.
talk of the world shifting towards a multipolar or regional order with the US,
Mhm.
China, and Russia competing for influence. Canada, almost irrelevant to many, has to determine how it's going to navigate this evolving landscape while managing a strategic autonomy. So the New World Order and Canada's place in it, how should Canada position itself given the shifts we're seeing now? Is there anything we really need to do differently?
Well, we tend to come along on American adventures, and occasionally, like the Iraq mission, we can say no. But Afghanistan, we couldn't very well. The Americans had been attacked, which triggered Article 5 of NATO that we all needed to pitch in together. But, the New World Order is a transition from the liberal international order, read America as dominant rule maker in a globalized trading system where they guarantee the security of everybody in exchange for open sea routes and trade that's liberal around rules. Now transitioning to multipolar world order, which is not unheard of in world history if you know your history of geopolitics. And in that situation, might is right more often. You do have rules, you'd like to fall back on them, but there's usually quite a bit of competition and scurrying about in violation of rules uh, as the great powers project their strength and their territorial controls over one another, whether it's for competition of scarce resources or economic dominance in some way. So we're transitioning. Trump is he's certainly the guy who's the catalyst for all of this. You've got the combination. It's a very, very difficult one for the rest of the world. You get the combination of enormous American power with an enormous ego of someone who wants to exercise that power, but then somewhat paradoxically, he wants to withdraw America from all of those very expensive commitments. And if you're a thinking person and you can use some of your empathy to put yourself in American shoes, you can see why he's quite popular in that regard, because $37 trillion in debt and leaving all their materiel behind in Afghanistan. And by the way, I headed the Afghanistan task force for a year. So, I got to witness that debacle up front and was also ambassador in Pakistan. So got a very close in look at what was causing that. That was an earlier phase of great power competition. But you watch all of that stuff and you kind of think, well, yeah, America can't really afford to keep that debt spiraling as they have their 800 military installations around the world and they're paying for European security long after the Warsaw Pact has been folded and long after the Soviet Union has disappeared. He's got to watch. He inherited this Ukraine war and he's looking at it and thinking, well, this doesn't fit into my global world order view. We're paying for this proxy war. The Europeans are doing a little bit, but not much. It's really American might. We're expanding NATO up to Russian borders. It's costing us a lot. And meanwhile, Russia has now aligned itself in this unlimited relationship with China. They've got Iran on side and North Korea and other miscreants. So, Trump looks at it and says, this is not good for America. And he's a real estate guy, wants to do business deals. It all comes down to property, whether it's rare earth minerals in Ukraine or property development in Gaza. You can see that his brain works in terms of, oh, I made the big deal. I'm the hero. Let me announce the deal. Here are my supplicants beside me, and I'm going to boast about how I did this deal, then I'll go on to another deal.
Well,
So I think that's the chaotic world order shift that we're
yeah.
involved in right now.
Well, you've echoed a sentiment that has emerged frequently in the last few months with us, and that is the debt in the U.S., the 37 trillion, and the possibility of rising interest rates, which would just absolutely cripple their flexibility. Even though it is the world's currency, it's the world's currency as long as there's trust in following that it will honor that debt. But the pullback to America first seems to be leaving Canada on the outside. What can Canada and what should Canada be doing? Should Canada start thinking more about its relationship with Europe or mend its and make sure it's mending and building its relationship and strengthening it with the United States?
Well, it's both, but it's exactly what we had preached and proposed in that foreign policy review that we did in the early 2000s, which, by the way, is the last foreign policy review that was ever done. And the outcomes after 9/11 were the real outcomes. Once the document was published, the Harper government took over and ran it through the shredder, so they weren't interested in the policy document that came out a couple of years later. No, we have to do both. We have to accept the fact that geography is destiny, and we have to make that relationship work. Dealing with Trump is not about going in and pulling a Zelensky, where you think, yeah, I'm gonna be tough and push back on the alpha male in the room. It's about looking into his strategy and finding the things that make sense for us, and then running with it like crazy. And border fentanyl. I mean, look at our inner cities. Why wouldn't you say, yeah, fentanyl? You're absolutely right, Mr. President. We got to do something about this. It's a shame we don't have a parliament that could pass an emergency budget to, give him the kind of boast that he wants, but at the same time, give us an action plan. Fentanyl from Canada going into the US is a minor thing, but fentanyl on our streets is horrific. It is destroying our cities. Anybody who's been along Hastings Street in Vancouver knows that this is a catastrophe. And America has the same problems. And so when Trump talks about the fentanyl problem, his numbers are going up in terms of popularity because everybody living in a city in the States sees the same thing we see. So it's a winning issue. Why do you want to fight on the issue of fentanyl? Of
Well,
course, it's preposterous. It's only 1% coming from Canada, but 1% is deadly to our cities. So this is a winner. Also on security, he says, well, why are we paying for NATO? It's not a bad question. Why is Canada not beefing up its own domestic security? Why are we involved so heavily, so automatically in these European tribal wars? It's been going on for so long, and we think that we're a European country somehow. And we were heroic in World War II. We liberated parts of Holland and Belgium, and we lost a lot of brave young men. But you look at what's going on in Ukraine, and it's a bizarre set of circumstances, and us feeling like this is an existential issue for us is a little far-fetched when we're not paying money to defend our own homeland. So, it's
Well,
another thing you could talk to Trump about.
if Trump is successful in this reset of the relationship with Russia, uh, being able to hold hands and find a balance. Some say this makes NATO irrelevant, which would be a peace prize for Europe. Critics argue that engaging with Russia, however, does indeed weaken NATO. But you've suggested a more pragmatic engagement approach that could actually strengthen Canada's security. Can you elaborate?
It depends how you look at these things, right? It's the pessimist versus the optimist view. Okay, so we're going to fight Russia to the very last Ukrainian, and we're going to make sure that Putin's government falls because we don't like that government. We're going to expand NATO until Russia collapses in some way. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that we will then grab Russia's resources and that we will somehow uh, rebuild Germany's supply lines of energy from Russia using our own wherewithal? That's preposterous, actually. You want Russia to be sufficiently independent without being out of control. I don't think Russia really wants to take over Europe. What a bundle of trouble. It's almost like Trump saying he wants to take over Canada. He doesn't know what he's what he's wishing for because he'd have himself quite a bundle of troubles to deal with, starting with the kind of essence of our French English identity and our cultural linguistic duality and all of those things that he doesn't understand. So, it depends how you look at this, but I think cutting off Germany's supplies, watching the German economy in turmoil now as it's not getting the energy it needs, it's burning coal, all of that stuff, and not to mention hundreds of thousands of young men dead. For what? They had a deal in Turkey that wasn't the greatest deal, but it's a lot better than the deal they're going to get now. It stipulated neutrality instead of NATO membership for Ukraine. Well, I've got a 20-something son. I don't want Article 5 triggered and send my son off to join an army in Ukraine fighting Russians. Thank you very much. I don't see it as my family interest or Canada's interest. I think dealing with the security of our country. The Yemenis could take out Canada with those $20,000 a pop drones. They could take out the port of Vancouver, the port of Montreal, the port of Toronto, Highway 401 down around Windsor. And what would we have? We haven't developed the port of Churchill. I brought the single largest investment in LNG to Canada over 10 years ago from Petronas in Malaysia, $69 billion investment to get LNG out to customers in Asia. Not a single drop has come out since 2012 when we concluded the deal. Not one drop of LNG has gone out. So now here we are shocked, thinking, well, how can Trump do this to us? Well, how can we do this to ourselves?
Well,
What are we
let's
doing?
stop. Let's stop right there. I mean, I'm going to deviate a little bit from the pathway and zero in for a moment on something you've just alluded to twice, and that is Canada's inability to manage itself as a nation. We talk about defense, we talk about military, we talk about east-west pipelines, we talk about interprovincial trade, we talk about fentanyl. We talk about banks complicit in money laundering. I mean, the list goes on, and we've been citing that in several webinars that Canada has a problem. Forget the US just for a moment. Until Canada grows up and has the capacity to manage itself as a nation, it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to itself. Where
Uh,
are we going to get the leadership that we need to participate as diplomats at the table, at the international table during this world order? Or are we just going to be a backwater, an afterthought?
well, until we exercise what is our real power, which is energy and minerals
Right.
and some agricultural products, certainly potash, as we've all seen very clearly
And
nowadays.
don't forget water.
Water as well. We've got abundant energy because of that water and freshwater supplies. We've got about 17 or 18% of the entire world's fresh water. So, and we've got amazing geography and a gateway to the north that's yet to be developed. And we could be doing a lot more, as I said, at Churchill in developing that port and not have to deal with Quebec's opposition to a pipeline going to the east by going out through Hudson's Bay if we had the iceberg. There's a lot of ifs here, but the fact is, Perry, you put your finger right on it. I think it's the laziest intellectual exercise, and I see it proliferating in every nook and cranny of Canadian commentary right now, to just keep pointing at Trump, the evil man to the south. When in
That
fact, we've got to hold the mirror up to ourselves and say, what are we? So maybe he's doing us a favor. I think people are coming around now to this other idea that this guy's doing us a favor. He's giving us a kick in the pants and a slap in the face at the same time, so we can see what our own problems are and do something about it.
I was reflecting over the last couple of weeks that the silver lining on all of this is that Trump has shocked us. And it shocked us to take a look at our own internal situation and recognize that if we can't learn to manage our own country, we're going to be vulnerable. Now, you pointed out something that seems to be generally unrecognized even by Canadians, and that is our geographic power. We are the buffer for North America from a north-south perspective. We have enormous resources, 3 trillion, some estimate, in the north, completely undeveloped, completely undiscovered. And it also serves as a buffer and defense for anyone wanting an incursion from the north to the United States. It's not just NORAD. It's the physical size of this country. We're 6 hours from the Arctic Circle by plane from Edmonton. 6 hours. That's the distance from here to Nova Scotia. And we don't even realize what we have north of Toronto, what we have north of Ottawa, what we have north of Fort McMurray is incredible. That's the
It's
front.
both a blessing and
It could be a
a
global
curse.
frontier. Could be a global
We
economic frontier.
we have a lot of trouble defending it. We have a very strange anomaly because we claim the Northwest Passage as an inland waterway. The Americans and the rest of the world essentially don't accept that. They see it as international waterways. So we're playing the role of China in this argument. They argue that Taiwan is an inland waterway because Taiwan is theirs. Now it's slightly different in international law because of archipelago law, which is why Chinese build these artificial islands and reefs to try to make that same legal claim. But I mean, theirs goes way beyond into the 9-dash line in the South China Sea up to the coast of Philippines and so on. But whatever. We are in a unique position. We do not have the tools to be a geopolitical player because of the way we have played it. We should be a voice of peace. We shouldn't be giving um, our aid into foreign, distant wars that don't involve our interests when we have not yet developed our own porcupine kind of domestic security where if anybody dares to touch us, they're touching some pretty sharp quills. That's what we need. And ballistic missile defense, do any of the old timers there remember how allergic Canada was in the debates around BMD? We couldn't possibly have missile defense on our territory. No, no. Let's let the Americans look after that. Well, this is where you wind up. If you refuse to defend yourself, but you find it nice to pronounce about the horrors of the Russians fighting with their Slavic neighbors in Ukraine, and let's do some training and send money over to those folks to keep the NATO alliance strong. That to me is a wrong order of priorities. I don't know how you solve it. We've got a political system where our head of state is the King of England, and we have a first past the post electoral system, which means that if the conservative government wins the popular vote, 2 votes in a row, they don't get to form the government. And they'll take another crack at it in the next election. We have no parliament. We're going to have a prime minister next week, I guess, who doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons, has never been elected to anything. That he's the leader of the Liberal Party, for which you need $350,000 deposit even to compete for the leadership of the party. So there's a lot for us to wake up and be a little more self-aware about in terms of our own democracy and the implications for our domestic development and our international role. We're
I'm,
not going to
I'm
be a world power until we get our own house in order.
So I'm going to come back to leadership in a moment, which is sort of that umbrella strategy is to have leadership to address the numerous issues. You've touched on defense. Russia's Arctic military expansion and China's growing presence are posing new security challenges, and we're acknowledging that. And Canada's current defense spending, its regard for its own military, the career of young people looking at the military as an option isn't even presented to them in our schools. Uh, Canada clearly needs to increase its defense spending and with a little more focus on the Arctic, and I think you've highlighted that. So let's shift gears now to the economy. Canada's vast resources, minerals, energy, fresh water, needs clearer national strategy to leverage them effectively. We've been spending the last 8, 12 years on social engineering, LGBTQ, woke issues, to be socially nice, socially respectful of one another. At the same time, we've ignored our economy. Our productivity is failing. We're vulnerable because of the lack of any diversity, and diversification is always going to be a challenge, but we need help. We need help. And that means we can't run away from the United States. We've got to figure out how to leverage our neighbor and leverage that relationship diplomatically with agreements that this becomes complementary and win-win. But the first thing we do when someone shocks us is to attack back. Is that diplomacy?
Well, diplomacy is something that, I mean, the language that is being used by some in this latest episode with our American cousins is kind of shocking. People talk about a war. They talk about the United States as an adversary. They are they are taking it so much to heart. They're really taking Trump personally. Some of the anecdotes about Trump's personal relationships.
Right.
I was listening to Piers Morgan talk about his meetings with Trump, where Trump would just be screaming at him like the Zelensky affair that we saw. He'd be just screaming at him and angry, and you'd think he'd never talk to him again. And 24 hours later, he'd call him up and say, "Hey, are we going to play golf on Sunday?" This is a very mercurial man who he's written a book about his style of negotiating. If you take it personally and you suddenly think you're in a war and you're going to somehow stop your relations with the United States, and if they're shooting themselves in the head over tariffs, we're going to shoot ourselves in the head as well, by God, to defy them. It leads you to the kind of behavior that you see erupt in warfare between countries. It's ridiculous. The Trump style opens up an opportunity for us to be more self-aware, to be more independent, and to look at some of the valid things he said, and to realize that some of that is pretty good. We should be more responsible for our own trade diversification and for our own security. Those are some of the things he's pronouncing on. Why wouldn't we do? That was what we were recommending back in the last foreign policy review, where we said, okay, multilateralism. Yeah, we've done a lot of peacekeeping and stuff, but that's last century. So let's look at bilateral relationships. Let's penetrate markets. Let's use our trade commissioner service. You'd be amazed at how few businesses Canadian businesses even know what our trade commissioner service is, and yet how phenomenal it is as an assistance to doing business in foreign markets. These guys have enormous networks and knowledge of market opportunities. They set up trade shows and stuff and bring people together for negotiating business deals and contracts and so on. The doors are open everywhere. But Canadian businesses find it easier to do business in the United States. They should not stop doing that business, even against these current tariffs. They should keep pushing and pushing and pushing. You don't give up. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But at the same time, you've got to be overseas looking at those markets, and the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service is capable of holding your hand if you need your hand held.
Well, I'm
So
glad
yeah,
you, I'm
we got a
glad you
lot to do.
glad you highlighted the importance of not looking at style, but looking at substance. He can be extremely distracting. It's an art to him. And it
Yeah,
seems to me so often we get caught up in the
yeah,
reacting to his style. And the metaphor that I highlight is, watch the chessboard, not the chess man. When playing poker, don't look at his hand, look what's on the board. But we
yeah.
seem to get caught up in fighting a style instead of figuring out how to manage substance. Let's talk about border security and immigration for a moment. You've emphasized the need for stronger border security and immigration reform to address workforce shortages and national security threats. We've talked about the security threats, but immigration, perfect opportunity. We've had massive immigration in the last few years, but not necessarily targeted in the interest of talent, just numbers.
Yeah. Well, I'm a former immigration officer at the beginning of my career and was responsible for delivering immigration programs overseas. Nowadays, one of my boards is a university, and universities are having a lot of trouble now with the restrictions on education visas, study visas,
Right.
and it's affecting the bottom lines of these universities. And we might have opinions on both sides of that discussion, but you remember all the shopping mall colleges that were growing up around the country in the big cities, where people were playing a game of using education as a wedge to get into Canada and then bring families over. So that was kind of an undermining of what we should have been doing in immigration, which was a controlled, manageable number of immigrants, and then making sure we get the proper skills that we need. Family class immigration is always built in. If you've married overseas and want to bring your family back home, to be able to do that. Um, but we just let it get out of control. The border, of course, has to be continually upgraded and monitored. And drugs and thugs is still an issue. It sounds old-fashioned, but fentanyl makes it very current. So, why wouldn't we do those things? You remember 9/11? You remember when they shut down the border crossing down into Windsor and trucks were queued up past London, Ontario? We knew, we know that we're incredibly vulnerable. We're in a marriage where we're married to a multi-billionaire, the richest spouse in the world, the United States.
Right.
And if we can enjoy that, we can enjoy all the benefits of that. But if they turn on you and start beating you, you better have you better have some escape hatches and some ability to look after yourself outside of that marriage.
Well,
Without,
Trump's made it apparent that we've got to work on that relationship with the United States and take into consideration both our strengths and what we can deal with the United States in order to win-win. We've talked about what we need to do internally in order to
Mhm.
strengthen our country domestically. But the topic of today, as we get into wrap up, is how what should Canada look like in this world order? What profile, what identity does Canada wish to have? And as a message to the next leader, Randolph, when you meet with him, what do you tell the new leader about what Canada needs to do or needs to be in the world order so that he develops an effective foreign relations policy?
Well, I think internationally we have to have uh, very strong bilateral commercial relationships. Commercial, not filled with sanctions over every little burp and belch abroad where we're unhappy with what a government has done. And so we impose sanctions. We've got so many sanctions now in so many countries, it's confusing. So we need to do that bilaterally. On the multilateral front, stop preaching about some arcane issue that nobody is particularly interested in and doesn't resonate with many other cultures. If there's a filter, make it peace support. We're capable of not peacekeeping so much, but peace support. If countries are in conflict, if they want to come to Canada and ask us for our advice on how to support dialogue and how to do demining post-conflict, we should be specialized enough to do that. That should be a meaty role. But if anybody wants to attack us, we're like a porcupine with incredible quills. You're going to get in real trouble if you step on us. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the United States is our closest friend and ally. We're going to be partners. If they want us to do more on defense of the North American continent, I have no problem with that at all. Let's invest in that. If they want that border to work better and stop drugs, absolutely sign us up. We want to do that. And we want to keep that relationship strong and healthy. We'll get through this storm, but we're going to have to take some actions in looking after ourselves and doing our part.
Well, we've highlighted Canada's role as a peacemaker, as an intermediary, as a mediator on a world scale, as a future role. We've talked about our undervalued resource strength and everything from water to agriculture to minerals to energy. And we've talked about the need for leadership. So we've got our hands full as we tell our young kids what the future of Canada ought to be. But I'm going to open up discussion now. I'm looking for hands. I often am. Anybody have a viewpoint they'd wish to share or a question that they'd like to pose to Randolph? Thank you, Randolph, very, very much, by the way, for what you've shared with us up to this point.
My pleasure.
Eric, you've often got a point to make, or Barry. Do either one of you want to lead off with a comment or a question?
Well, if I can go ahead.
Sure, go ahead. Go ahead, Eric.
I've got two questions. The first one is, can you give a good example of who you think is a successful porcupine internationally? Who's gotten it right? Like, I don't think we've gotten it right. So who has gotten it right? And the second one is, I've been looking a lot at hybrid conflict over the last couple of years. And how do you address it? How do you defend against it? How do you potentially fight against it? Because that's all about being able to resist somebody in an asymmetric relationship, right? And so I was hoping, and I've put some categories in the chat, and this is from it was Unrestricted Warfare, published by the Chinese. I think it was 99 or something like that. And if you have any thoughts about those and that approach about becoming a better porcupine.
Yeah, those are really good questions and not easy answers. Who's a successful porcupine? The ultimate is Israel. And isn't it ironic that they are the most successful with their lobby in Washington? The US political culture is about lobbying. So I think Canada's been pretty good at it. And what our people are doing down there now, we've got a really effective embassy. We've got premiers and provinces represented in Washington. They're lobbying like crazy. They're doing a good job.
Are they
These
lobbying?
people are not.
Are they getting the message consistent?
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
But there's nothing on the scale of Israel. They know how to work that system, and there are historical reasons for that. That's a totally different order of magnitude, though. The French, nobody's going to attack France. They've got a nuclear umbrella. In fact, they've recently said they would be willing to extend it across all of Europe. So, nobody's going to fool around with France. We could go further into that and look for other examples, but ours is unique because we're on a continent with the Americans. We have NORAD. So it's a matter of doing our part that's complementary to show the Americans that we're willing to carry a pail along with them. In terms of hybrid warfare, that's the world we're in. When the Houthis can shut down passage of shipping, with very cheap drones, that building ships, battleships, and sailing through the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, those platforms are sitting ducks for modern missile warfare and satellites and so on. They'd have to get their payload off awfully fast to be effective at all. Submarines, on the other hand, are still pretty effective if you want to go nuclear. Very effective, but do you want to go nuclear? So then you're into the cyber domain where you just try to disable or make your opponent, your adversary, dysfunctional by bringing down their internet services, their banking, all of their systems that are so reliant on the internet now. You can cut cables undersea to do that, or you can use satellites. You can also do anti-satellite warfare. Um, you can do espionage that unsettles your opponent. You can use social media against your opponent. You can stir things up and create division within a political opponent. There's so much now in warfare that just talking about the procurement of big systems, big weapon systems like advanced American fighter jets, they cost $1 billion a pop or something like that. It's really not a wise spend when you can do it much more effectively in a kind of a modern integrated uh, set of tools that you use to make yourself both lethal offensively and pretty powerful defensively.
Yes, thank you.
I want to pick up a question that I have in the chat, and that is Bob Mitchell's asked, NATO has agreed that each member must spend 2% of their GDP on their own military. That doesn't mean that 2% necessarily goes to NATO. Isn't that self-defense?
Yeah, well, most of it goes to the American military-industrial complex, with some of it going to the Brits, the British arms manufacturers, and the French, and a few others. But what you really should be focusing on is whether you need, and to what extent you need, armed forces. And then you judge. It's ironic, that the Turkish brokered deal for Ukraine and Russia limited Ukraine's military to about 80,000, 85,000. And of course, the critics said that's absurd. That cuts their military in half. That's still bigger than Canada's, and we have much more territory. So, you start from what your needs are in terms of personnel, and then you work through how do you equip them? What's the strategic plan for fighting or defending yourself on a continental basis? What are your ally commitments? And then to what extent do you see in your planning a need to and an ability to project force overseas in that kind of a scenario?
Jeff, you want to unmute?
Yeah. Thank you for those insightful comments, Randolph. And with regards to Ukraine, I see this probably looking at it from a more historical perspective. The United States and Canada were willing to fight communism in Korea, and the United States was willing to go to war in Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism. They almost went to nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So now Russia isn't communist, but they're an oligarchic dictatorship, and they're threatening Europe as well as all of the former Soviet republics. So I think if we are to learn anything from history in terms of, Hitler and the Anschluss and the Sudetenland, this looks like history repeating to me. And so, I personally am in favor of supporting the Ukrainians because essentially by doing so, I think we're preventing the spread of this kind of tough man dictatorship.
Go ahead, Mark, Randolph.
Well, that is, Jeff, you've outlined the argument for this very succinctly, and that is what many people believe. I think the other side of the argument is that why is NATO expanding up to Russia's border? We would never tolerate it. The Americans certainly wouldn't if it was happening in Mexico. We saw what happened in Cuba. So who's the aggressor here? Why was Biden saying we've got to have regime change in Moscow? That's not to say that Putin is some nice guy. He's like he runs it like a gangster with oligarchs, and anybody who crosses him suddenly falls out of an apartment building or their plane blows up. I mean, you'd be crazy to make apologies for Putin, but when you're in a great power um, paradigm, which we're in now, as much as we want to deny it, how far do you want to push up to the borders of one of the great powers? And what's Canada's role in doing that if we're not a great power? So, I don't think that it's worth hundreds of thousands of young men's lives, Ukrainian and Russian, to get Ukraine into NATO so that we can then invoke Article 5 when Russia invades Ukraine again, if they decide to do so, and send our men over to fight that fight. I don't think Russia's got the capability to take over Europe. I don't see evidence that he's intent on doing that. The Americans undermined the government that was friendly to Russia in 2014. And the warnings were that, I mean, Putin was asking if he could join NATO in the 2000s. When they were part of the G8, they were in the club. But the Cold War won't go away. And Russia and Putin have a great deal of responsibility for this. But so do we. So I'm a diplomat. I want diplomacy. I want negotiations. I want a settlement. I don't want to see hundreds of thousands of young people dead.
Before asking Alona's comment, Randolph, I was made aware a few weeks ago in one of our interviews or one of our discussions that Russia and Ukraine had come to an agreement orchestrated and mediated by Turkey a week before the invasion. And that agreement was undermined by Yellen telling Ukraine, you go to war.
Well, what happened was it was after the Russians came down the highway and invaded after giving some warnings, and then they sent their negotiators off to Turkey to do some negotiating, and the two sides had agreed on. It's a document that's over 100 pages, so it had a lot of detail. It was about language rights and cultural rights, and it was about denazification, and it was about limits on military, and it was about neutrality. It was all sorts of clauses in there. But then Boris Johnson came in from the UK and told Zelensky not to sign off on it in the final form, and to continue to fight Russia, and the Americans and NATO would back them, and the rest is hundreds of thousands of dead people. I
that
really
intervention
cannot stomach any argument that involves, yes, it's worth hundreds of thousands of men dead because we didn't like diplomacy. No, let's fight.
Ilona, you're a mother. Go ahead.
I'm a mother and a grandmother, and Randall, thank you for this. If the singing starts in the background, it's Mark downstairs and I can't stop him. I was at the event on Friday night, and I watched because the event on Friday night was at the Village Park. It's a sports hotel. All of the athletes who come and compete in Calgary at the university stay there. I watched these young men and women walk in and out, and I started to cry. And I still cry when I watch them because those young people are being killed, not in Calgary, but in Ukraine and in Russia. And I want this group to start something to stop the slaughter of young people. That's all I ask.
The event that Ilona is referring to is we had a dinner in Calgary to discuss sovereignty. Bill Jones was interviewed, and the discussion was dynamic. Rich echoed many of the sentiments that we're talking about today around Fortress North America versus Fortress America. But Ilona has picked up on the fact that in the hotel, there were many young people, and she's reflecting on the sensitivity that she had as she left that discussion, realizing that it's all well and good to have these haughty discussions, but people are out there dying, and they're young people, and they're not ours. So thank you.
That's right.
Eric, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I don't know what I've done wrong with this. I've lost my picture and everything, Perry, but that'll just carry on. What a broad question for Randolph is, how do we get Canadians to think and act more globally? And I'll give you just three quick points I want to make. One is on the resource development, and I'm former CEO of Syncrude, and I do a lot in that area, and I'm former chancellor at University of Alberta. A lot of different things. I know Canada's strengths, and yet we are so galactically narrow in Canada. We set our climate change targets around just our national emissions. You know, we know this is a global issue, and you can reduce greenhouse gases anywhere in the world, and it has an impact. And we're sitting on all these phenomenal resources like the LNG. We're still going to need 35% of the crude oil barrel doesn't go to energy, but all these other projects. And yet we want to phase out our fossil fuels. We put up barriers. We won't build pipelines. I mean, how can we possibly not see the global thing? The second example, I know it's a dumb question, probably it's too broad, but the second one is, how can we continue with these interprovincial barriers? I mean, if you thought at all globally, and you know that Canada on a population scale is so tiny, we have to work together. It doesn't take a rocket science, and we can't even have the same emergency response kits in provinces. We have 10 separate standard emergency response kits. Can you believe that? And it goes on and on like that. The other one, though, and I have this from a personal example, I've done a lot with the Ditchley Foundation and getting young Canadians, working with Kevin Lynch, over to these big global conferences in Oxford and things like that. And I see good Canadians, young Canadians, and even other ones that go get this great global experience. It's almost a negative to them when they try to come back to Canada. You know, so Randall, you've seen so much of the world. What are we not getting when we don't value this global experience?
Well, you've said it probably better than I can, but I have a lot of sympathy for what you just said. I did my doctoral research on Canadian energy policy, and also participated in a survey of 3,000 Canadian households on their energy consumption habits. So got a good insight at the household level of what Canadians know and what they think and what their opinions are, and actually how they consume. And we consume a lot of energy, despite what we might say to the contrary. And so there's a grinding of some misunderstandings of the global environment and our role in it. You know, we do emit, but it's minuscule compared to China and India. You know, it's 1.5% of global emissions. I referenced the Petronas deal that I brought in for LNG in the Montney region in British Columbia, biggest investment in Canadian history, $69 billion of investment. A lot of that money has been removed because they couldn't get the LNG out to any pipelines, to any port, before you can get it to the Asian customers. So they come up against environmental headwinds. That's what it is. And that makes the government popular to pronounce on environment in ways that don't make a lot of sense in a global context. And the carbon tax, of course, is a great dissuader of investment and consumption. So, you know, we're in a funny headspace in terms of public opinion, public understanding, and it's going to take decades to get past this. We don't have a lot of decades when you're up against Trump in Washington, but boy, there's a lot of misunderstandings of where Canada could exercise a tremendous influence, and a positive one, on the world, because LNG. You know, I have friends in Indonesia who are digging out coal by the shipload and sending it off to China to burn. Why isn't that Canadian LNG, which would yield far less environmental damage? It's beyond me.
Before I call on Bill and maybe get into a wrap up, Randolph, there is a view in the United States that we are abandoning people, that we're firing left, right, and center, that the Department of Efficiency is ignoring the plight of individuals who are going to be left without a job. Is there a way to move forward with this focus, this new focus in Canada on the economy, without ignoring the fact that we are a compassionate society? We may not be as virtuous as we may have appeared internationally in the past, but we've got to get this thing in balance. But there will be those that react and see us focusing on the economy now, thinking that we are abandoning our compassion for people. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I don't think we ever will. We're the healthcare nation, and not one of us here on this call wants to give up the healthcare system that we've got. Despite its problems, we like this system, and it is one of those things that binds us as much as winter weather and hockey and things like that. But our social programs are valid, they're strong, they're widely supported, they're in constant need of improvement. So somehow we have to write the other side of the ledger and balance off. But sending another 20 billion in somehow manipulated Russian assets off to Ukraine is not really the right thing to be doing in terms of fiscal priorities, and yet that's what we're doing. So we do our home budgets connect to these foreign wars that we're involved in. Until you get your foreign policy straightened out, it's really hard to straighten out your domestic policy. And the reverse is true as well.
Thank you. Bill, you've got a comment or a question you wish to pose?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador. Your talk was very poignant. I just have to quote the Polish Prime Minister a few days ago, asking why is 500 million Europeans asking 300 million Americans to defend themselves against 150 million Russians. Putin has no interest in Europe. It is a response to the NATO movement towards. My question is, in your article there, and something that Perry had raised about hugging the bear, where do you see Russia-US cooperation in the North? Is that a realistic idea, given the current political situation? Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Yeah, it's a good point. Donald Tusk of Poland didn't mention the 40 million Canadians who are contributing to this Ukraine effort as well. And you got to ask why, as I've been asking during this conversation. But, Trump is sending very mixed signals. He wants Greenland. He wants to have a bulwark against Russia and China in the North. The bulwark is Canada, it's NORAD, and we could do a lot more. So I think the conversation with Trump is not to oppose, it's to say, look, you're absolutely right on this. We should be defending our continent. Canada should be doing its part to defend itself more, reallocating resources and topping them up for our own security. And the North has to be a great preoccupation of ours. We're protected in a way against foreign adversaries by the two great oceans to our left and right. Right, but to the north, we're not really protected because that frozen ice flow up there provides a platform for moving heavy equipment across it. And yes, it is difficult to open up those ice flows. The Russians have nuclear powered icebreakers that can do it a lot better than anybody else. So they have an advantage, but really the frozen ice is what allows them to get heavy equipment across there that's more threatening to our sovereignty. So we're not matching those movements in any way, whether it's icebreakers or the movement of equipment or settlements or the development of the port of Churchill on Hudson's Bay. We're not doing any of that. Why aren't we doing it? We're focused on Ukraine. We're focused on NATO. That's our number one priority. But gosh, we're not going to let Putin get away with 1 inch of retaliation against NATO expansion up to its borders. That's a very funny priority to have.
I agree. All the dollars they poured to the Ukraine could have built 10 pipelines. It's amazing.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to wrap it up, Randolph, with a comment. I'm going to read the paragraph from the last newsletter that I think echoes in a constructive way what we've been talking about today. It reads that our relationship with the U.S. is a partnership worth defending. The U.S.-Canada relationship is more than just friendly alliance. It has been anyway. It's a foundational element of North American security and economic resilience, and I emphasize North American. From defending the Arctic to supplying critical resources and securing fresh water supplies, Canada is an indispensable partner, I hope that's recognized, in maintaining stability amid global uncertainty. Yet Washington's recent disregard for this relationship risks undermining its own security. Economic pressures, political posturing, and trade disputes ignore the reality that Canada is not just a neighbor, it's a strategic necessity. And I think we've highlighted that it's possible that this is simply a shock, not a long-standing disagreement, but one to simply get attention so that we can together resolve and build this fortress North America versus a protectionist America first and only. As the world enters a new era of geopolitical competition, Russia, China, North America, the U.S. must recognize that Fortress North America is only as strong as its northern pillar. No way, USA, North America. Ensuring Canada remains an integral, well-supported ally is not just a matter of diplomacy, it's an imperative for North America's collective security and prosperity. Moreover, ensuring that Canada's energy, mineral, agriculture, and water resources are developed responsibly, and with foresight will be as critical as any military alliance in shaping the future stability of North America. Leadership is needed in order for that thing to become realized. Good diplomacy and an open, positive discussion with the United States, as I've seen some of our premiers have gone to the United States and worn a positive overture instead of a retaliatory one. So I'm optimistic. You echoed that. One can approach this as an optimist, as a pessimist, as a realist. I'm hoping that optimism prevails. You have the last word, Randolph.
Yeah, thanks. I have a hard stop and I'm past it already, but
Okay.
my last word is this. We're being taught a lesson. We've learned this lesson in the past. It's time to learn it now and do something. Stop just crying and being the victim and waiting for, another decade of ultra dependency. Let's learn a lesson and do something. Do we have the political leadership? Not yet.
Well, we
Nice
should know
talking to
in the
all of you.
next month or so. Thank you very, very much. So you're free to go. I know you're past your deadline. So thank you very, very much. Excellent.
Great chatting with you. If
So
anybody wants to connect, just send me an email. Bye
okay,
now.
we'll do so. I look forward to reading your material in future too, and
Bye-bye.
certainly watching this leadership race when we have our next election. Hopefully, this is front and center.
Let's hope so. Bye now.
Thank you. Any others, since we have a little bit of time just for a chat, any things that weren't raised today that that you felt should have been touched on, or perspectives that you don't agree with? Go ahead, Tom.
Maybe I am just incredibly stupid or something, but I don't understand this tariff business. Now, I think Trump has already achieved such a negative economic environment out there for investment in our country. Those big factories and whatnot could very well pick up tomorrow and shift off to some place in the States, leaving behind thousands and thousands of workers who haven't got any jobs. So I just don't understand where we're going with it and what's the next steps we should be doing.
Well, briefly, I'll make a comment and then I'll ask others to respond. He's already relented. We believe that what has occurred is a shock to wake us all up and to sit down and have a serious discussion.
That's for
So
sure.
let's not light our hair on fire and get panicky and do a bunch of stupid things and play into his hands of stupidity. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the weird thing about NATO spending is that for a country like the United States, it's a regional economic stimulus. right? They
Yes.
have their own defense manufacturing. If we spend 2% of our GDP on weapons, we're probably sending all that money to the US, in addition to paying tariffs. And if we use some of that budget to hire our own people, then that part stays within Canada. So, as long as he's got tariffs, I think we should be looking for weapons suppliers that aren't in the United States and help our other NATO countries and just boycott US military weapons.
Well, the whole approach to military seems to be abandoning hardware and beginning to look at things like intelligence, drones, almost virtual war. I think the military industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned us about, seems to be shifting. And the war in Ukraine seems to be reflecting that. Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just talk on that point, and I completely agree. We're seeing a shift in the military strategies that once again, defense is dominant. With your aircraft can't fly over Ukraine, vice versa. Surface to air missiles are too good. And as you said, drones defeat the biggest tanks. Back to the comment regarding why is Trump doing the tariffs and what is his purpose? Again, we have to not look at, say, why is he doing this to Canada? We have to take a look at why is he doing this for the US. We have to remember economically, the US is in serious debt trouble. And there's, as far as a country, there's only 3 ways to deal with it. You completely cancel the debt, and too bad for everyone else. You devalue your currency with certain negative effects, or just like a human being who's under debt, you have to produce more. You have to increase your productivity to pay down the debt and typically take a lifestyle hit or really produce and maintain your lifestyle. So you have to overproduce. And that's why he wants to bring back his industrial base. One of these days, the magic pieces of paper called American dollars are going to come flooding back to the United States in a search to buy goods with those dollars. And the Americans have to produce goods. And so, again, it's not necessarily an attack against Canada. It's a wake-up call for Canada, but more of a increase the productivity and products the United States needs to produce to convert those products, cars, whatever, appliances, ship them overseas for US dollars in return and reduce that debt.
Thank you. Others?
Yeah, there's just so many things to try to unpack here. This trade war is completely unnecessary. And even if he wanted to bring attention to the fentanyl and those sorts of things, which he's already done, that has been done. We've seen him relent on the tariffs regarding autos now. I don't know, you made a comment earlier. I don't know if he's taking tariffs away altogether, but it just has been an entirely unnecessary sideshow. And I agree with was it Bob earlier, who was saying that we should, consider canceling our purchase of U.S. military equipment. I know that the CF-18s need to be replaced, but at $1 billion a pop for the F-35s, at a time when drones are becoming more effective overall, it seems like we could spend that money better. And it was at the behest of the Americans during the Diefenbaker administration that we canceled the Avro-Aero program. Maybe we start some military programs again. Maybe instead of sending money directly to Ukraine, maybe we start building artillery shells and start sending them arms. And that way, the money is being spent in Canada and we're just sending them products, which is basically what a lot of the American donations have been in the form of obsolete equipment. We could also send them our Leopard 1 tanks that are sitting in mothballs right now.
Say that again.
I mean, the discussion that has just occurred, Bob, thank you, is really about what should Canada be doing when it comes to defense and comes to military in the future. Who do we buy from? What do we produce ourselves? And what is the nature of war, or the nature of defense, or the nature of military into the future? What does it mean to our youth and our future sources of military? How do we do recruitment? Who do we recruit? And what do we expect that they will be doing? It's a new world. This new world order shifts not just the relationships, but appears to be shifting the very technologies that have historically been used and may not be used in the future. As we look at AI, as we look at intelligence, as we look at drones, as we look at virtual, what do we need in order to defend the North? Do we need aircraft carriers? Do we need ships? What is it that we will need in order to defend the North into the future? That's I don't think we have the answer today, but we've got the question.
And it's not realistic for Canada to set up its own military production. That's way too costly, and that was the primary reason why the plane was taken out. Is just couldn't make the dollars work in the mass production that the U.S. can for their own airplanes for the rest of the world. We do need to align ourselves militarily in supply and equipment with the United States, no matter how that goes. Yeah, the Eurofighter certainly, but you're looking at where the conflict may be that NATO was set up for, which was in Europe, and that's where your parts and concepts are coming from. You do want to align with the United States militarily because it's in the United States and parts are easy to get across the border. So I don't see any move away from the U.S. military supplying Canadian forces except for, what is it, the Bearcat, the personnel carrier. We do that. Very successful little machine. And we sent ours over to Ukraine as well.
It seems to me what I heard from Randolph, and one of the reasons why I was impressed with what I had read that he had written, was his perspective on Europe and a recognition that maybe we've gone overboard with this view that Ukraine and saving Ukraine is necessary in order to save Europe, as if Russia is indeed a threat to all of Europe. He has a different perspective in that regard, and it's worth listening to. The other point that he made that I think echoes a sentiment that we've shared extensively is the need for Canada to grow up. And I don't mean that as an insult to my friends. I don't mean to share it with the KEI network as a criticism. But we as a nation have some very serious problems that have gone ignored by former leaders in this country. And it relates to our costs. It relates to our East-West relationships. It relates to interprovincial trade. It relates to defense. It relates to immigration. I mean, it's hard to mention something that doesn't really represent a significant problem.